So we've made it to the third and final Indiana Jones movie. At least, that's how I like to look at it. Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. So The Last Crusade is the third Indiana Jones movie, and if you've seen my reviews on the first two movies, and especially on Temple of Doom, I talked about how Spielberg really pushed the PG rating to the point where the MPAA was like, well, we gotta come up with some new rating to accommodate this teen market that Indiana Jones seems made for. So now we have PG-13, and The Last Crusade is rated PG-13, even though as far as intensity and violence and gore, it's definitely a step down compared to Temple of Doom, but I would even say that compared to Raiders of the Lost Ark, Last Crusade is still not as gory or violent. There's not as much blood or gore, even though there is still a lot of action adventure type violence. And the ending in this one, just like in the first one, has some horrific imagery, but it's still, as a whole, not nearly as violent as the other two. And I think this was Spielberg and Lucas kind of overcorrecting just a little bit based on all the backlash they got in the last two movies. But even though this movie does play it safe a lot of the times as far as what it shows, that doesn't make it a bad movie. Last Crusade is still a very well-made Indiana Jones adventure, but one thing that does stand out as different or unique about this movie is its opening. It doesn't start out with just a normal Indiana Jones side adventure, you know, something small scale that we've seen in the past two movies. Instead, we get a flashback to young Indiana Jones. He's a Boy Scout, he's a teenager, he's played by River Phoenix, who does an amazing job as a young Indiana Jones. He's got the quirks and mannerisms of Harrison Ford down to a T, and he just did a phenomenal job. But like I said before, Indy's a Boy Scout. He's in Monument Valley with his troop, and he comes across these archaeologists that are digging up the Cross of Coronado, which is a religious artifact. It belongs in a museum, according to Indy, so he steals it, and now he's got these guys on his tail, and he has to hop on this circus train to try to get away from them. And here you'll notice something that was evident in the other movies, but is handled almost perfectly here, and it's the comedy. This is a really funny Indiana Jones movie. There's a lot of jokes and gags and situational humor and surreal humor that really works to the film's advantage. And it kind of plays up the tongue-in-cheek nostalgia that this Indiana Jones franchise was built upon in the first place. And it has a lot of fun with it. And I think a lot of the credit goes not just to Spielberg and Lucas, but also the writer they got to write the screenplay this time around, Jeffrey Boehm, who you might recognize as a writer for Lethal Weapon, another kind of tongue-in-cheek action adventure movie franchise. And I think that tone works so well with the Indiana Jones franchise, and you see it right out of the gate. They have a lot of fun with the different animals that are on this train, and as he goes along, you start to see the pieces of Indy's origin story fall into place. First, you see Indy fall into the reptile car, where he's greeted by a million snakes and one really big snake that jumps out of the water, and he straight up has a panic attack, and boom, that's where his fear of snakes came from. But it doesn't stop there. He falls into their car with a lion, and he has to use a whip, and he whips himself in the chin, where that's where you see the Indiana Jones scar. And it also explains how he learned to use a whip in the first place, so that's kind of cool. But after this intense and surprisingly comedic chase on the train, Indy comes home and he's met by the sheriff, and the sheriff is like, dude, you gotta give the cross back because they got witnesses in his private property, so you lost today. But then the head archaeologist guy that looks an awful lot like Indiana Jones, who goes by the name of Fedora, which even for Indiana Jones, that is a lazy name. He shares with Indy some words of advice, and he actually gives Indy his hat, his fedora, and that becomes the classic Indiana Jones hat that we know and love. And right there, it transitions into the present day, or 1938, it's close enough to the present day for Indy. And you see him on this boat in the middle of the Pacific Ocean in the storm, and it's wet and raining and waves are coming over the side. I've never seen Indiana Jones be so completely drenched from head to toe in any of these movies. And it's a pretty memorable set piece to differentiate a lot of the classic desert landscapes that we associate with Indiana Jones. But the situation on this boat is Indy once again trying to steal the Cross of Coronado from this rich, white-hatted dude who claims to own it, but Indy's like, no, it belongs in a museum. And after another pretty intense fight, he jumps off the boat explodes, and he floats safely to shore. And the next thing we see of him is teaching his archaeology class at his university, and I'm still not entirely sure what university it's supposed to be, but that's beside the point. But I like this scene because it's not just repeating what we saw in the beginning of Raiders of the Lost Ark. It's actually quite the opposite. Where in Raiders he was disappointed and he told Marcus that he was sorry that Belloc stole the idol, but he had these little trinkets that he could put in the museum to kind of compensate the expense. But here, this is 1938. Belloc is long dead, and you see him smile at Marcus, and he actually succeeded in one of his adventures, which is the first time we've really seen that from not a main Indiana Jones story, but the opening Indiana Jones stories. Because like I said before, in Raiders he didn't get the idol, in Temple of Doom he didn't get the diamond or Nurhachi, which is what he was going after there, because he was poisoned, he just needed the antidote and he needed to get the heck out of there. But here, Indy is victorious, and it's a nice progression to see in Indy's character, his experience to where he was in those movies and where he is now. But that happiness doesn't last long because he gets abducted by Walter Donovan in a really shady way where immediately you're like, oh, these are the bad guys. But then we see Indy in this really nice and expensive and affluent library that I only assume is part of Walter Donovan's house or mansion or whatever he has. And Donovan is this rich guy that's passionate about archaeology, and he shows Indy some of his things that he's found. And the big thing is this tablet, this stone slab that has a bunch of information about the Holy Grail on it that could potentially lead people to finding the Grail itself. And throughout the conversation, it's revealed that Donovan has led an expedition to find it, and that his dad was the project leader on it, and his dad has gone missing. So Indy's not too thrilled about that. So now Indy's on a mission. He's gonna go find his father. He really couldn't care less about the Holy Grail and that whole quest, and he doesn't even really believe in it, but he does ultimately care about his father, and he knows that his father is way over his head. He's not a field man, he's a bookworm, he's a professor, just keeps to himself in his class. While Indy is the opposite of that. Yeah, they're both professors, but Indy actually goes out into the field and encounters very dangerous situations where his father wouldn't do that. And this takes Indy and Marcus to Venice, Italy, and they meet Elsa Schneider, played by Alison Doody. Now, Elsa is an interesting character, and Doody plays her pretty well. I think she's a better love interest than Willie Scott in the second one, but not quite as good as Marion in the first one. And I think part of that isn't necessarily her fault, because she's ultimately the femme fatale. She's the spy. She is the classic Bond woman that is secretly working for the enemy and gets close to the hero so that she can turn on them and take what information they've learned together and use it for evil purposes. And in this case, she's working for the Nazis. Yes, the Nazis are back because, it's still Europe. It's the 1930s. The Nazis are coming to power. And Hitler historically was obsessed with the occult and magic and mythology and using that to win the war and achieve ultimate power. So it does kind of make sense that the Nazis would kind of be the evil opposite to Indiana Jones in their quest for historic artifacts. But before Indy finds out that she's even associated with the Nazis, or that the Nazis are even in the picture in this movie, they go into this library which leads to the catacombs, where they find the second marker, which is on the shield of Sir Richard, one of the Knights of the First Crusade. And it's an identical inscription to what was on the stone tablet that was only partially completed, and now we have the full picture, so now we know how to get to the Holy Grail, which is great news. And the diary that Indy's dad sent him has a map that he made where it shows specifically from Alexandretta, the city where you start from, how to get to the Holy Grail from there. It's all mapped out as clear as day. An idiot could follow it. But before they even do that, Indy's got to go save his dad, and he's being held in this castle. So Indy goes off to find his dad, and Marcus goes to Alexandretta to meet Sala so they can start the quest for the Holy Grail with a head start. The only problem is that his dad's being held by the Nazis, and like I said earlier, Elsa is a Nazi spy, so they both get captured and the diary is in the hands of the Nazis now. But more importantly, we now know who plays Indy's dad, and it's Sean Connery. James Bond himself is the father of Indiana Jones, and that's just amazing. Because in my Temple of Doom video, I talked about how it seemed like they were injecting more James Bond tropes and James Bond isms into the Indiana Jones canon, which is a great idea. The Bond films are a lot of fun. They're high adventure and espionage and traveling the world, and it seems like a pretty good fit with the rugged archaeologist mythology tropes that they brought up in Raiders, and I think they complement each other really well, which is why it's so cool that we have Sean Connery playing his dad, because now you literally see where that James Bond influence, that James Bond flair comes from, because it was his dad. But anyway, enough nerding out about James Bond. Now they're captured in this castle, they're tied up, and they nearly burn the whole castle down trying to escape. The Nazis are on their tail. And now we have a really exciting, if not a little too short in my opinion, motorcycle chase. And I guess now is as good a time as any to bring up the action in this movie. It is still just as good as the action in Raiders of the Lost Ark and the action in Temple of Doom. The action in these Indiana Jones movies is so good, and I cannot stress that enough. If you want to learn how to film and stage and choreograph great action sequences without relying on a lot of CGI, look at these Indiana Jones movies, because all the stunts and effects were practical. They were on the set, and you can tell, and it heightens the whole experience. In fact, there was a really good canal boat sequence that I kind of glossed over back in Venice that was also really exciting, especially when you see it backing into this propeller that's just chopping up bits of this boat, and it keeps getting closer and closer, and you're like, how much time do they have left? And you're biting your fingernails. It's really well staged action, and this continues throughout really the whole movie. But now that Indiana's dad have ditched the German army, they now have to go back into the lion's den again and get the diary back from Elsa, because apparently there's a lot more in the diary than just the map. There are 3 challenges or booby traps that you gotta complete once you're there to get the Grail. And Professor Jones wrote a little cheat sheet down in his diary so that they can pass it successfully. So they need to get it. So they go to Berlin, and you see this Nazi rally and book burning, and Adolf Hitler is there, and like the high German officials are there, and it's this parade. It's pretty much what you would expect Berlin to look like in the late 1930s at a Nazi rally. And it's about as dangerous and unwelcoming and threatening a place as you could imagine in any of these Jones movies. And it culminates with Indiana Jones getting the diary from Elsa, but then being pushed into Hitler. Hitler himself is in this Indiana Jones movie, and he gives Indy his autograph, because this whole crowd wants Adolf Hitler's autograph, so he just puts his name in the diary, and I don't know, that always got a chuckle out of me. Just Adolf Hitler, this monster of history, writing his autograph and giving it to Indiana Jones. And I don't know, that just makes me laugh. But now they gotta get the heck out of Berlin, so they get on this blimp, and the blimp takes off, then they get found out, so the blimp starts turning around, so they go into this biplane, and they fly away, and now we have an aerial chase. And this movie really is all about the chase sequences. We've had boats, we've had motorcycles, we've had trains, now we have airplanes. And the airplane one is good, and there are some good moments, like when Professor Jones shoots off the tail of his own plane because he doesn't really know how to use a machine gun. Like, that's funny, but what kind of takes me out of it a little is that the green screen, or I think it's blue screen in this case, really shows. And it shows a lot more than in some of the other Indiana Jones movies, because they also use some blue screen there too. But there's something about the lighting in some of these shots, it just doesn't look quite right. And I'm like, man, these shots are well composed, and it's a good action scene, and it's exciting, but the effects just don't hold up that much. And if I'm honestly reviewing this movie, that is something that needs to be addressed. But now we come to the big physical challenge of this movie. In the first movie, it was this big German mechanic dude, and in the second movie, it was the same actor playing this big Indian guard dude with a whip. And in this movie, it's a tank. Yeah, the actor that played these 2 guys is in this movie, but he's only got like a bit part, and he doesn't really fight Indy like he did in the others. But this battle on and in the tank is some of the most intense action of any of the Indiana Jones movies. It's so good, and it just keeps going. First you're trying to get on the tank, then you're fighting the guards that are in the tank but they're coming up, and then you're with the professor and Marcus in the tank fighting the Nazis in there, and then you're with Indy on the tank and he falls off the tank and he's hanging onto the side but he's about to be crushed by rocks. And it just keeps going until the tank inevitably falls off a cliff, and Indy survives, but Vogel, the German dude, he does not. And by the end, Indy just looks exhausted. He looks beat. He just kind of sits down for a minute. And everybody else is like, Indy, what are you doing resting? We're almost at the end. We gotta go to the third act. We gotta get the Grail. And while they are right, Indy does need to get up and go get the Grail before the Nazis do, you do kind of identify with them that after this long sequence with this tank, you kind of just want to take a breath and just soak it in and recuperate a little bit before you go and complete these challenges. So now let's talk about these challenges, because even though I just talked about how great the tank sequence was, these 3 or technically 4 challenges has always been my favorite part of this movie. First of all, because they filmed at Petra, which is a real place. This facade was not a set made for this movie. It's a real place. It's in Jordan, I believe. Could be wrong about that. And it's real and it's breathtaking, and it's amazing that they were able to film there because it's a great location. And every time I see this movie, I'm just blown away by how impressive that is. But also because the sequence of these challenges is the beginning of Raiders of the Lost Ark all over again. Now bear with me, it's not exactly Raiders of the Lost Ark, because yeah, there are some things different. The traps are not identical, but thematically they're very similar, and I don't think that's a coincidence, because George Lucas helped write this story, and if there's one thing you know about George Lucas is he likes it when his stories rhyme. And at the time, they thought this was going to be the conclusion of the Indiana Jones trilogy. And how great would it be to have the final treasure hunt in some ways echo the first time we saw Indiana Jones ever, and the first glimpse that we got of him, and the first adventure we saw him go on. I just think that's too good an opportunity to just pass up on or just label it a coincidence. Because what are these challenges? The first challenge is the breath of God. Only a penitent man will pass. So you have people walking in this tunnel with cobwebs and mist, and then the cobwebs start to move, and boom, people are decapitated. And already I'm like, okay, so these movies are not completely sanitized now. There's still some pretty horrific imagery during these challenges. So I'm like, okay, they were just saving it to the end. But when Indy goes in, he knows, okay, the penitent man, they're humble before God, they kneel before God, so he kneels, and this giant saw blade comes out of the wall, and there's one that comes out of the floor, and he does a tuck and roll, and he's through, and he's clear, and he stops the blade so that other people, the Nazis, can come through. Oh yeah, and I guess I should mention that Indy's doing this, again, out of the love of his father, because Donovan, surprise, surprise, he's a Nazi, which we kind of all saw coming a mile away when those really shady guys pulled up and abducted Indy in the very beginning. Yeah, Donovan shot Professor Jones point blank in the gut. So now Indy needs to go and retrieve the Holy Grail so that he can save his father. Again, Indy in this movie is not motivated by greed or ambition or even archaeology. He's doing this because he loves his dad. And that's something to really think about later on. But going back to this trap, I do kind of see a parallel between these saw blades and the light in the tunnel in Raiders of the Lost Ark that shot out the spikes that would impale you and kill you immediately. And even though they're not exactly the same thing, I think they're still in the same ballpark, and they have the same kind of glow effect and spider webs and stuff. But moving on to the second challenge, Indy's got to do biblical hopscotch, where he's got to spell out the word of God, and only in the footsteps of the Lord will he proceed. And if he steps on the wrong letter, it's going to fall out from under him, and he's going to go into this abyss of no return. Again, kind of mirroring the very specific footwork that Indy needed to do when he went up to grab the idol so that the darts wouldn't come out of the wall and kill him. So again, he's got to step very carefully as to not spring any traps. But now we come to the third challenge, the path of God. Only a leap from the lion's head will he prove his worth. And this is a leap of faith. There's this giant chasm that's way too far for anyone to jump, and again, it kind of mirrors the chasm that Indy and Sepito had to whip and swing over in the beginning of Raiders of the Lost Ark. But here the chasm is even wider. He can't really use his whip, so now he finally needs to hunker down and take that leap of faith and step out. When he steps out, he says, yes, there is a bridge there. It's just this really weird optical illusion where the surface of this bridge looks exactly like the walls of the chasm, so it just looks like a pit. It looks invisible. But Indy walks in no problem. He sprinkles some dust behind him so that everyone else can kind of come through. And now Indy comes into the room of the Holy Grail, and he meets the knight who's just ready to die. He's so old, and can't even pick up his sword anymore. But before Indy can grab the Grail, Donovan and Elsa come in, and they see that there's not one Grail, but there's a whole bunch of Grails, all different kinds and styles, and it's really anybody's guess as to which one's the real Holy Grail. And the knight says that you must choose wisely, because the true Grail will give you life, but the false Grail will take it from you. So Donovan, not really knowing what the Grail looks like or even where to start, trusts Elsa, and she picks one out for him, and it's this gold bejeweled one that looks very fancy and ornate. And he's like, yeah, this is the cup of the King of Kings. It's important and it's noble and it's valuable. So of course this is the right one. So he takes a drink and he decomposes before our eyes, and not the most bloody way, like his face doesn't melt or anything and there's no blood, but you just see him get older and older and older, and there's this stop motion puppetry combination where you see the skin like kind of eat away at itself, revealing the skull underneath, and the eyes roll back, and he just kind of turns to dust. And it's really kind of creepy and intense, and you see him basically turning into the mummy before your eyes. And I'm like, okay, fair play to you. You're still earning that PG-13 rating. So now it's Indy's turn to choose, and he chooses this very humble-looking cup. And he's like, yeah, this is the cup of the carpenter. This was Jesus on earth. He didn't come to rule, he came to serve. So he takes the cup, takes a swig. You've chosen wisely. And he takes it out and saves his dad. Everybody's happy, but then Elsa gets greedy. She's like, it's ours, Indy. We can go now. And she takes it too far, and the earth starts shaking, and the floor cracks, and the Grail falls, and Elsa's just hanging on to Indy, but she wants that Grail, and the greed overtakes her, and she falls and presumably dies. But then Indy also falls, and he's holding on to his dad, and he can actually touch the Grail. He's a lot closer than Elsa was. And now he's tested. Does he go for the Grail and ultimately end up dying, or does he let it go and go with his dad, his motivation throughout this whole movie? And you can imagine what he chooses. He chooses to go with his dad, and they pack up and they leave. And Indy and Marcus and Sala and Professor Jones, they ride off into the sunset as the Indiana Jones theme plays. And it's just a very wholesome way to end this amazing franchise, until they ruin that. But I'm just going to pretend that that doesn't exist for now. But ultimately, what do I think about The Last Crusade? I think it's pretty awesome and a lot of fun. Does it play itself a little too safe some of the time, kind of harkening back to that first movie a lot? Yeah, but as for playing it safe, it does it so well, and it still does bring new life into it. The whole father-son dynamic I think is great. I think the Grail lore that they've more or less created for this movie is really interesting, and it helps keep the narrative going. And most importantly for me, in rewatching these Indiana Jones movies, I've been trying to track Indy's faith journey and where he is with religion and God, and what he believes and what he doesn't believe. And chronologically speaking, this takes place after Raiders of the Lost Ark, so he's already had that kind of eye-opening faith experience with the Ark. So here it is consistent to say that he has begun to take some more things on faith. When he goes and he investigates the Cup of Christ, he's not as jaded or skeptical as he was when he was going after the Ark of the Covenant. And in one of the best lines in this movie, uttered by Donovan, he asks Indiana Jones to really question what he believes. And when you see him take that leap of faith over that chasm, he puts his hand on his heart. I personally take that as him finally putting his own life not on fact or on history or on the science of archaeology, but on faith and the acknowledgement of a higher power out there, which then not only rewards him in completing all these challenges, but it also gives him kind of the insight to really think about what is the correct cup of Christ so that he can do it and not die. And ultimately, I think that's a really solid note to end this franchise on. Would I like to see more Indiana Jones movies and seeing him tackle other religions and other artifacts and finding new things and new booby traps? Of course, these movies are incredibly fun, and it's a franchise that you could stretch out, keep coming up with new adventures, and just keep it going like the James Bond franchise. But after watching The Last Crusade, I'm perfectly satisfied with having it end right there, because Indy's arc is complete. He's reconnected with his father, he's got a new sense of faith, and the good guys ride off into the sunset at the end. How much more perfect an ending could you ask for? So those are my thoughts on The Last Crusade and the Indiana Jones franchise as a whole. And if you're anticipating a review of Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, don't be. It's not going to happen anytime soon. And it's not just because I don't like the movie and I don't really want to revisit it, but ultimately because I don't have access to it right now. I don't have the DVD available to me right now. So maybe over the summer I'll get around to it, but for now I'm just gonna go to reviewing other movies and, I don't know, maybe tackle another Disney classic. I know you guys really like those. But now I turn over to you guys, what do you think about The Last Crusade, and where would you rank the Indiana Jones movies? I ultimately still think Raiders of the Lost Ark is the gold standard and will always be the gold standard for Indiana Jones. But right behind that, I have to put Last Crusade, and then a little bit under that, Temple of Doom. But whatever you think, let me know in the comments below, and if you like this video, be sure to give it a like and subscribe for more content, and hit the notification bell to be notified every time I upload a video. And as always, I'm Colby. This is my nerdy talk, and I'll see you in the next video.